Defence Dialogue, a podcast discussing contemporary challenges in the area of European security and defence. Brought to you by the Martin Centre with Niklas Nováky.
Welcome everyone to another episode of the Martin Centre's Defence Dialogue podcast. My name is Dr. Niklas Nováky. I'm very happy to be talking to you again on another very topical issue with my colleague Álvaro de la Cruz from the communications team of the Martin Centre, who's going to be commenting and sharing his thoughts also on the issues that we are talking. Initially, because today's Friday, the 20th November, and the defense ministers in the EU Council will be discussing, among other things, the European External Action Service's threat analysis, which the EAS has been preparing for the forthcoming strategic compass. So my initial intention was to focus this episode on the strategic compass to give a little bit about background and then what to expect in 2021 when it will be drafted. But then, as always, the political agenda changes, and the major kind of discussion point this week and the previous weeks in the area of EU defense cooperation has been this rather interesting and surprisingly public disagreement between the German defense minister Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer and the French President Emmanuel Macron when it comes to the precise meaning of the EU's ambition of strategic autonomy and how strategic autonomy should be interpreted and how it should be pursued. And this is quite an interesting debate that has been. Usually these sort of disagreements and debates, they take place in the council and in the various different kind of working groups and in the meetings where officials and ministers meet. But this one has been very public. So it began at the beginning of November when Ms. Kramp-Karrenbauer published or wrote an op-ed to Politico, in which she talked very explicitly about strategic autonomy and mentioned that Europe should give up any illusion of strategic autonomy, in a sense that if it means abandoning the reliance on the US, because the view of the German defense minister, very understandably, is that Europe still is very reliant on the US for its security, especially in the nuclear sphere. Because at the moment there's only one nuclear weapons armed state in the European Union, and that's France. And issues like nuclear deterrence, which is the ultimate safeguard of Europe's security, are something that are always discussed in the context of NATO, not really in the context of European Union at all. And we haven't had really a single debate in the context of the European Union about what role, for example, French nuclear weapons will play in the EU's security policy. So Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer wanted to push against some tendencies in the strategic autonomy debate, especially those that seem to suggest that strategic autonomy should be an ambition for the European Union to cut the reliance on the United States and basically go its own way in security and defense. And this was very interestingly picked up by the French President Emmanuel Macron in a very substantial interview that he gave on the 16th of November, if I remember correctly, in which he discussed a wide variety of different issues that have to do with the future of Europe and European defense. And in this debate, Macron said that he profoundly disagrees with the German defense minister's view as expressed in the Politico article, and even called it a historical misinterpretation of the concept of strategic autonomy, and Macron very much gave the kind of French Gaullist interpretation in which we must kind of pursue strategic autonomy to the greatest maximum extent to make sure that Europe is an effective and credible international actor. And then obviously AKK Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer had to respond. And she did this in a keynote speech she gave earlier this week. and in which like she tried to kind of tone down like some of the disagreements between her and Macron, saying that when it comes to Europe's security and the necessity of Europe taking more responsibility for its own security, I mean, that's something that they basically agree. But then the problem is when it comes to suggestions that the Europe could pursue a completely autonomous defense policy from the United States. It would completely like cut its ties to the United States and NATO. This is not really an option because Europe is still very much reliant on the US nuclear deterrent, the nuclear umbrella, and also the vast majority of NATO's capabilities are still provided by the US. So there's still quite a big gap between like some ideas of strategic autonomy and then what is actually achievable in the near to medium term. And what this really kind of boils down to is this, we might call it like strategic ambiguity on strategic autonomy, because strategic autonomy was introduced first in a really kind of big way at the EU level in the 2016 global strategy, which was prepared by the European External Action Service and not formally adopted or endorsed by the Council, by the ministers, by the member states. And in this global strategy, there was no formal definition of like what strategic autonomy means. There was one definition in another document from 2016, the 2016 implementation plan on security and defense, like which the European External Action Service also prepared to kind of give guidelines on like what the EU's concrete level of ambition should be in this area and how it should be taken forward. But that again, like that was not formally endorsed by the Council. But this definition said that Europe's strategic autonomy should basically mean that Europe can handle security challenges, especially in its own neighborhood, like when it's necessary alone, but in cooperation, like with its partners, and especially like with NATO, like when it's all possible. And because of this continuing ambiguity on this really big ambition of strategic autonomy, which has come to characterize a lot of EU initiatives, also outside security and defense, technology, security of supply, energy, etc. There has been like quite some time these various different types of disagreements on the precise meaning of strategic autonomy, but never quite so publicly at such a high level as this. So voila, that's the overall kind of situation where we find ourselves today.
Well, good morning, Niklas. Thank you for the introduction to the topic. I think it's very useful. I want to start with one question from a quote of AKK's op-ed in Politico. She says literally, there is an overwhelming strategic need for strong transatlantic cooperation. I think whether we are capable of defending ourselves without the United States' help or umbrella, or even if Macron's strategic autonomy is possible today or in a few years from now, it's kind of sad that we reduce the reasoning and the argument to a need or a pragmatic, I think it's a very Germanic approach, the pragmatism, the need for the United States or the benefit of having them with us. I think regardless of that necessity, we should be together because of much more fundamental ideas. I think the transatlantic alliance is something fundamental to consider the West and our civilization and many other levels, from cultural to defense. And I don't think, depending or not on the Americans is the question. The thing is, we should be together either way. I mean, I don't have no doubts that you have the strategic autonomy to do this podcast by yourself. But we decided to do it together because we want to do it together, not because you need me at all. Don't you agree that it is a little bit sad that we are reducing the question to whether do we need them or not? We want them. We want to be together, don't we?
Well, I first of all, I want to thank you about the suggestion about like my own strategic autonomy, but I have to say that even in this case, I mean, my strategic autonomy is very limited because I'm very kind of deeply reliant on your expertise and know-how. So, I mean, I think kind of we can end up kind of having the same sort of kind of strategic autonomy debate here as well. But I think kind of you're absolutely right in like what you say. And I think both Macron and AKK, they agree more or less on the fundamentals, but I think kind of the main issue or like point of misunderstanding here boils down to the nuclear issue. Because in Germany, the strategic autonomy, the way it's been discussed, and the way it's been discussed actually in most EU countries, like is defense that what the EU can do in the context of its common security and defense policy. And nuclear issues obviously are not part of that. But in the French context, I mean, strategic autonomy itself is a term that has been taken from the French like strategic discourse. And in France is obviously at the moment the only nuclear weapons state in the European Union after the UK left at the end of last year. And in the French political discourse on strategic autonomy, the nuclear weapons have always kind of been a big part of that. So my kind of feeling or sense is that this is really kind of the key point of difference. Like, so what I mean is that both Macron and AKK, they agree on the fundamentals of what the EU should do, or like how strategic autonomy should be pursued. But then, because in the French political discourse, like the nuclear element is very closely associated to the strategic autonomy point in France, France kind of finds it difficult as a nuclear weapon state to kind of think of strategic autonomy or restrict strategic autonomy to non-nuclear issues as well. But I think kind of my hope is that like over time, the ministers and the leaders of different EU countries like will find a mutual tone on this. And I think the strategic compass process that has now started and which will then produce a document that will be adopted in the spring of 2022, like will also be a good opportunity, hopefully, to provide some clarity on how strategic autonomy should be pursued and like what it precisely means. It's a very theological debate, and it's not strictly speaking the meat and bones of what the EU is doing in security and defense. I mean, the EU is doing a lot of very concrete things when it comes to capability development, for example. But I think it's still good to have a common understanding of what this big overall like ambition means.
Yeah, sure. The thing is, not only to me, an early millennial, but probably to most of young Europeans, the nuclear threat seems like 20th century, like very old. Like we see cyber potential attacks, we see terrorism, we see so many threats that do not relate at all with nuclear powers or nuclear superpowers, that it seems like so old in our minds. For example, the capabilities to fight common threats in the Sahel or whatever involve many kind of infrastructure, of course, items, armory, whatever. How can France, for example, impose a strategic European autonomy without, for example, participating in EU defense key projects such as Eurofighter, because they want to benefit their own national defense industry? I think it's kind of hypocrite to advocate for that and then not participating in every single key project. Or how do we strengthen our European defense autonomy with just a few thousand soldiers on Erasmus in Ilke-Grafenstadt and outside Strasbourg that just change the path of the NATO in the morning and put the European Union badge in the evening? I mean, if we don't have a common commitment and an universal commitment around the member states, and that is very far from happening, because of course you have examples like France or Greece in which defense is strategic, but in countries like Spain or Italy, or specifically, especially when you have left-wing governments in Europe, for them even increasing the budget in defense is something completely out of the question. So how do you address all of these realities and all of these issues in order to really achieve a strategic autonomy?
Well, I think this also kind of boils down to the question of strategic culture, because I mean, what you alluded to is the very different, very understandable different threat perceptions and priorities that the member states have, like which has to do with their like different histories and different geographical locations and different dependencies. I mean, obviously, if you're a country like Luxembourg, I mean, which is surrounded by friends in all sides, I mean, your threat perception is obviously like quite different compared to the threat perception of Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, even Spain or Italy on the other side. And this is one of the big reasons, like, I mean, why it's quite tricky to achieve a common understanding of things like strategic autonomy, even though like we might agree on a like broad level that it has to do with boosting the EU's overall kind of capacities and ability to take more responsibility for its own security. But then when it comes to the actual meat of it, I mean, we quite often find ourselves in these disagreements of like what we should do and crucially like what we shouldn't do, like in the context of the European Union. And here as well, like, I mean, I do hope that the strategic compass process, I mean, will provide some clarity. I mean, the EU has a bad tendency of over-promising like quite a lot, especially like when it comes to different defense initiatives. Things like the battle groups are a good demonstration of this, because they were hailed for a long time as one of the EU's flagship capabilities, but they have never actually like been used in practice. But nevertheless, I mean, one of the aims of the strategic compass is to kind of facilitate a common or at least a more shared strategic culture among the member states by boosting understanding of these different threats and sensitivities that the member states have, and like perhaps it'll like lead to a more harmonious, unanimous like understanding of strategic autonomy as well. Like, even though it'll be a tricky debate, as the Franco-German debate has like made it quite clear.
Yeah, regarding the Franco-German debate, one elemental issue that also threatens, in my opinion, the strategic autonomy, the potential strategic autonomy for Europe, at least on defense. We have several member states that do not belong to the NATO alliance. We have some non-European, non-EU member states that do belong to the NATO alliance that are actually increasing threat to member states. I don't have any doubts that following the treaties of the European Union, in case of a real threat to a member state, we will all come and aid our fellow member states. But how do we solve this Turkish issue with the Germans on one side of the equation and France or Greece or many other member states on the other? How can we even show unity in these kind of issues? Today is Turkey, but maybe tomorrow is something else.
Well, that's the $1 million or €1 million question at the moment. I mean, indeed. I mean, the tensions between the European Union and Greece, Cyprus especially, and then Turkey on the other side, having increased quite a lot this year when it comes to the situation in the Eastern Mediterranean. And at the moment, like it looks like Turkey's also proposing a permanent division of the island of Cyprus. I mean, which would like further increase tensions and then distrust between the European Union and Turkey, which is very unfortunate. Because Turkey is obviously also a very important and valued NATO ally and a very strategic country that we've had to rely on. We will rely on many important aspects of security. But the fact that the current political leadership in Ankara has chosen to use quite harsh rhetoric, has chosen to take actions that are not very conducive to a cohesive alliance, and I would say even in some cases undermine like alliance solidarity and cohesion, are very regrettable. And the problem is that these tensions in the Eastern Mediterranean, the delineations of the exclusive economic zones and the delineation of the maritime territories, they're such sensitive issues that have to do a lot with kind of national pride in all sides, that at least for the moment, it feels difficult to achieve a mutually kind of beneficial or acceptable solution. But I do hope that over time the Turkish side also like will see the value of a strong and cohesive alliance, and like, I mean, there will be like some sort of movement to de-escalation and like restoring the cohesion of the alliance. And perhaps the new Biden administration in the US like will also be a good opportunity in this sense, because in the past especially, I mean, the US has played an important role in kind of facilitating and mediating conflicts in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Clinton administration, for example, and I hope the next U.S. administration like could also like then help these EU efforts, like when it comes to finding a more acceptable and like mutually beneficial solution that importantly also protects the territorial sovereignty of Cyprus and Greece.
We all hope for that, for a very strong Europe, a very strong United States, and moreover, a very strong North Atlantic alliance. Thank you once again, Niklas, for inviting me. I'll let you close the episode.
Thank you so much, Álvaro, and I think kind of this has been a strategic partnership, and like, I mean, that kind of facilitates strong strategic autonomy at the Martens Center when it comes to defense issues, and thanks a lot for like participating in this episode as well. And I do hope to record the strategic compass like episode sometime in the near future as well, to kind of share some thoughts on that process as well. So thank you very much, and thanks to everyone for listening, and stay tuned, stay safe, and have a good time wherever you are. Cheers.
That was today's episode of Defence Dialogue. Subscribe to our podcasts for more.